Excellencies, dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who has joined us online or will later watch this video. And this makes me remind
WebEx
that I
Assistant
haven't
is
done
enabled
something
to save audio highlights.
important. I have just launched a tool that allows people to access to what we are saying in various languages. So with that, let me continue. Welcome to this executive briefing on the upcoming United Nations Biodiversity Conference, organized within the framework of the Geneva Environment Network. Before I give the floor to Sylvie Motard, the director of the Europe Office of the United Nations Environment Programme, who will be moderating today's session, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of this executive briefing will be made available on the webpage of this event. My colleagues are sharing the link in the chat. Let me also mention that other sessions are taking place around the world and in Geneva in preparation of this major conference, concluding this year's cycle of important environmental negotiations. I would also like to highlight the briefing organized by the Geneva Liaison Office of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization last week, highlighting the role of sustainable agriculture in safeguarding biodiversity. You will find the link to that event and other relevant resources on the webpage of this event. Throughout our event today, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box, and if time allows, we will address these before the closing remarks. With that, Sylvie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Diana, and welcome to all of you to this session. It's really a pleasure for me to welcome you to this event organized within the framework of the Geneva Environment Network. Well, we know it has been an extremely busy month for environmental negotiators and stakeholders. We started the month with a meeting of a conference of the parties to the Convention of Wetlands here in Geneva. The meeting of a conference of the parties to a convention of climate change just ended in Egypt, and the meeting of a conference of the parties to a convention of international trade in endangered species of wild fauna and flora in Panama took place. All those meetings are linked with the next highlight of this year. In a few days from now, in Montreal, contracting parties will meet for the second part of the UN Biodiversity Conference, which includes the 15th meeting of a Conference of the Parties, so-called COP15 to the Convention of Biological Diversity. The 10th meeting of a Conference of the Parties serves as the meeting of the parties to the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety, and the 4th meeting of a Conference of the Parties serving as a meeting to the parties to the Nagoya Protocol on access to genetic resources and fair and equitable sharing of benefits. This conference happens at a very crucial moment and is expected to adopt the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The framework provides a strategic vision and a global roadmap for the conservation, protection, restoration, and sustainable management of biodiversity and ecosystem for the next decade. As humanity is facing the triple planetary crisis of climate change, nature, and biodiversity loss, collaborative action is needed from all sides of society to restore harmony with nature and foster a transition to sustainable socio-economic system. So the adoption of a global biodiversity framework is an important step to commit to action that protects nature. Biodiversity and nature conservation is mainstreamed in the multilateral activities of International Geneva, home to some of the key institutions that actively contribute in setting the global agenda to tackle the biodiversity crisis. We will have and we will hear many of those actors today. And today's sessions will provide updates on the preparation of this event and the perspective from the Geneva Biodiversity Cluster. Let me also briefly mention that other communities from International Geneva have been closely preparing the UN Biodiversity Conference, including human rights, finance, trade, disaster risk reduction, among others. Stakeholders have strong roots in Geneva. They are not on the panel of today's event, but we want to highlight their engagement. So I will have the pleasure to moderate this session, and we'll be introducing our guests as I give them the floor, starting with Elisabeth Mrema, Executive Secretary of the Convention of Biological Diversity, to whom we are extremely grateful to make some time for us just a few days ahead of this important event. Thank you, Elisabeth. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sylvie, Excellencies, colleagues, friends, and greetings to you all. Indeed, I'm very honored to join you all with an update of the preparations for the upcoming CBD COP, as we have mentioned already, Sylvie, as well as with my co-chairs to update you on the status of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework negotiations. So my special gratitude to you, Sylvie, and the team in the Europe office for really creating this space for this discussion. And I'm pleased to see that I've been joined by other agency heads, as well as members of the civil society and private sector representatives at this crucial briefing in preparation for the UN Biodiversity Conference. You have mentioned, Sylvie, we are in the triple crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, and all of which are intimately linked and cannot be successfully addressed apart from one another. The current decade has been labeled as a decisive decade. We must really come together to make this decade one of a unified action. This time, the time has come to draw together the world commitments, including under the Paris Climate Agreement, the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as the upcoming legally binding instrument on plastic pollution. So the time is now, and because now we know we are all at crossroads, and recognizing the importance of this moment, we must work together to understand, to address, and to respond to this triple planetary crisis. You have mentioned, Sylvie, the important work which has been done recently by the recently already completed conferences of the parties, Ramsar Wetland Conference of the Party 14, Desertification Land Degradation Conference of the Parties 15 in Cote d'Ivoire, CITES COP which just ended in Panama, Climate COP which just ended in Egypt, ongoing negotiations for the plastic pollution going on in Uruguay, and all leading as we complete the year to really continue that momentum and progress the work at the UN Biodiversity Conference or COP15 and others. The members of the Geneva Biodiversity Cluster really stand uniquely positioned to provide the leadership during and aftermath of this Conference of the Parties. And this briefing session presents that important opportunity for sharing the perspectives and updates on the ongoing preparations. As Sylvia has mentioned, our conference of the parties is actually a tripartite conference, so to speak, with the 15th conference of the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the 10th meeting of the parties to the Biosafety Protocol, and the 4th meeting of the parties to the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. But this conference, or all these meetings, will be preceded by the 5th meeting of the open-ended working group on the further development, hopefully finalization of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The open-ended working group is tasked with finalizing the preparation of the revision or revised version of the Global Biodiversity Framework, a primary outcome for consideration and adoption at COP15, among other decisions to be taken at the same meeting. Their work is informed by the outcomes of the recently held informal group convened here in Montreal during the last week of September. And this meeting was able to produce a streamlined, coherent text based on the draft framework produced during the 4th meeting of the open-ended working group held in Nairobi in June. In addition to the consideration of the draft text of the framework, the Conference of the Parties will also consider draft decisions recommended by the Convention subsidiary bodies, namely the subsidiary body on science and another one on implementation respectively, which both met in Geneva in March this year. Some of the decisions to be negotiated provide guidance for the implementation of the global biodiversity framework. For instance, resource mobilization strategy, digital sequencing information for genetic resources, plan of action for capacity building, technical and scientific cooperation and technology transfer, and knowledge management, among others. Other decisions to be adopted include gender plan of action, a communication strategy, an action plan for the long-term approach to mainstreaming, and decisions related to a range of scientific issues, including agriculture, marine biodiversity, health, and invasive alien species. And delighted, I'm joined by the co-chairs of the Working Group on Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, Francis Van Havre of Canada. Francis Ogwal of Uganda. I hope he has been able to join, as well as Basil Van Havre of Canada, who have worked tirelessly for the last 4 years, actually, to reaching this point to helpfully finalize the text of that framework. And we'll hear from both of them about the status of negotiations, particularly the outcomes of the informal group and the preparations of the upcoming open-ended working group due to begin this weekend. And what then still needs to be done and finalized in order to be able to produce a good text for the ministers to consider for adoption at the CBD COP15. Dear representatives of the Geneva Biodiversity Clusters and civil society, private sector, all partners joining here. As I said, your leadership, your commitment are required as we head into the negotiations of the open-ended working group later this week and soon after at the COP itself. It is now time for country delegates to finalize the negotiations of this framework in order to enable its adoption at the Conference of the Parties. And we call all those of you who will be present here in Montreal in the next few days and beyond, really to come with strong mandates, not only to ensure your views are carried through the negotiations, but also at the same time to enable the rest of the negotiations to find consensus, compromises, and solutions. We count on your support to conclude the process of the Global Biodiversity Framework and really shape the outcomes of the COP15. And we call on you all to engage with your counterparts across the civil society and private sector with a view to generating that collective will to implement the framework once it is adopted. The framework will be a blueprint for action, pillar of socio-economic recovery to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity, to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and to achieve our 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. Delighted that the registrations so far are great. We have over 12,000 participants registered, and believe it, the majority of which are from the private sector. So really seeing the private sector, business, financial institutions coming on board to contribute to the global biodiversity framework, in addition with other stakeholders, since traditionally that had not been the case. So we must all play our part as we head to this final period for the global biodiversity. And let us all ensure that the framework translates into opportunities that lift and support people and nature everywhere. This is our time to make the changes needed. I thank you for your kind attention, for your continued commitment and valuable leadership. Thank you. Thank you, Sylvain.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And completely aware and convinced. I think we are all very convinced about the importance of commit ourselves to this process and to a successful outcome. I retain two things very clearly from what you said: is the importance of mainstreaming, also the importance of cross-sectoral approaches to make this framework a success, and also create opportunities for what it is basically our life support system, which is common to all of us. Thank you so much, Elisabeth. And allow me to move to Basile van Havre. You mentioned already, co-chair of a CBD open-ended working group for post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, Environment and Climate Change, I believe. Over to you, Basile.
Thank you, Sylvie. Good day to all of you. It's a pleasure to be back. If I'm not mistaken, we were together in February ahead of Open-Ended Working Group 4. And the other things I will note is I'm very pleased to see that Elisabeth is mixing Francis and my name. We've been working so close together that I take that as an honor. Francis may not be able to join us, so I will take the presentation on my own, and then if he joins, we'll adapt. So I'll be sharing my screen now, and you should see that momentarily. Sylvie, can you signal me if you can see my screen? Great. All right. So let's start. I'll try to give you a very quick brief on where we are, the process, a little bit on where we are, and then what we got in front of us. In terms of the process, if you've seen that graph several times. Last time we spoke was when we were heading to Geneva in February, and now we're going to be zooming into what's left in front of us. As you know, in June we've had a meeting in Nairobi. That meeting, as you know, it's that step in the negotiation process where you get a very hard, long, difficult text. And as Elisabeth mentioned, we were given a mandate to have an informal group do a technical review of the draft, which they did. They simplified the text, remove about half the brackets and a quarter of the length. And this is what is going to go into the 5th meeting for 3 days later this week. Then we will basically roll on into the first week of the COP and continue with that work of simplification with the aim of delivering to ministers a draft with ideally no bracket, but realistically there will be some issues for which we will need them to engage. The framework itself, you've seen that in various ways over the last few months, but we get the left part, which is the best assessment with the 5 drivers of biodiversity loss. And maybe as I'm talking to a network, you can see each of you in that graph. We've talked about the wetland convention around land and sea use change. We've talked about the CITES COP that just took place around the direct exploitation, climate, which is the Sharm el-Sheikh COP, pollution, which the one coming up, and invasive alien species. But let's focus on what we're trying to influence here, which is in between the current states and the vision. And what is really important to understand is that as part of the GBS, we're defining some goals, which are measurable expression of the vision in terms of outcome. So what is the result we are trying to achieve here? And behind those, the famous targets, all that is in the context of means of implementation, enabling environment, and this very important, more robust planning and reporting system, which we call responsibility and transparency. A few words on 30 by 30. It's a target that has gathered a lot of media attention. It is a very important target, but it should not be looked at in isolation. It should be looked at together with target 1 and 3 around land use planning, restoration, and conservation of wildlands. One key message we want to leave with you is 30 by 30 is a major important target, but it's a critical one, but it's not a sufficient one. We need to address in a balanced way all of the drivers of biodiversity loss. And then finally, it is a global target, meaning that I think everybody recognizes that parties will have different capacity to implement the targets according to national circumstances. A few words on climate change. It's a very important point to make. Equally at COP27 recently in Egypt, but 26 in Glasgow, there was a recognition of the links. The IPES identified climate change as one of the direct drivers, and the IPCC as well has identified that safeguarding environment is a fundamental tool to address climate mitigation and adaptation. How does that materialize practically? And I want to salute the work of Switzerland in terms of working on the synergies between the various conventions. Is how can we set up system for one window financing, one window monitoring and reporting, perhaps through and hopefully through the DART system, as a way to facilitate the implementation across the convention. At the end of the day, the negotiation and what I see coming up at the end is that there will be three issues that will need to be negotiated together, and obviously there is the issue of the ambition on the targets, and again that notion of a balanced approach to the five drivers, but that has to be negotiated together with the resource. And that's the financial resources, but also the transparency and responsibility. And that's what I see as the triplicate negotiation that will take place through the Open-Ended Working Group 5 and the COP. Now, this group is a group where it's going to be very easy to talk about how the values piece work together. So this is not an isolated convention working on its own. It's a convention that works with other instruments, others, for a collective goal. So basically, we saw at COP26 the contribution, the importance of conservation and protection, the phasing out of subsidies on oil and gas. Then a few months later, UNEA 5, with a seminal decision on the plastic agreement, which I think is meeting as we speak in Uruguay. And that's going to be a very important contribution to the overall biodiversity agenda. Then we move on a few months later to the WTO decision on fishery subsidies, which is another great contribution to our work. And then on to UNFCCC COP27, which is contribution we know very well. And then in a few weeks we'll be at that last box on top of the stair, which is going to be on the contribution that COP15 can make to a global agenda. Will it be on agriculture transformation? Will it be on phasing out negative subsidies, and particularly in the agricultural sector? We'll see that through the negotiation. What I should have done with this slide is that another flight of stairs, moving up to the next convention after that, and definitely will be happy to contribute to that as we move along. Now, practically, what can we do? And let's get into the detail. And Elisabeth has spoken about the informal group, and that's going to be a key point for us. Will be to make sure that this work is used and considered. This mandate was about the mandate of the informal group was around coherence, redundancy, consistency, and ease of communication. It was not a negotiation group, and we've been very strict about that. This was kind of a technical mandate to do a simplification of the text, and there was plenty of work to be done with that. We've met for around 60 hours over the course of 5 days. The group was very well set up, 5 representatives per region, and one thing we've asked the region is to reflect the breadth of the views. So it was not a club of friends and chumps, but it was a group that reflected the various perspective. I won't repeat the bottom parts, but basically, as mentioned earlier, this is a text you can actually read, and hopefully some of you will. And definitively the recommendation will be to the open-ended working group to use that text and to use it in their deliberation. What's going to happen at the Open-Ended Working Group 5? Don't expect speeches. It will be a bare minimum plenaries. Apologies to Elizabeth. But we will jump into the work as fast as we can. We will try to work as much as we can in contact group. We will prioritize the elements that were not discussed in Nairobi. There is a number of those. Those elements that are not dependent on Substa and SBI. So let's leave those for later in the COP. And those that have the best potential for resolution. 3 days is not a lot of time, and we can very well fill up the time with those 3 priorities, which is likely to mean that a number of elements, targets, and sections will be discussed later. And you can find a scenario note that provides some details on that. Your engagement and support, many friends on this call and the Geneva network has been very useful in talking to a crowd and a number of people that are very close to the action. So you understand that very well. Supporting the process and I think what we're trying to build with Francis over the last few months and years is a bit of a different framework, one for the whole of society, and I'm very, very pleased to see private sector representative on this call and private sector representative in large number coming to Montreal. When I'm talking to the media, I'm always asking, but don't you think it's going to be like climate? And I think the situation is different on biodiversity. The private sector is very wide, diverse, and basically is a force that pulls us up in terms of ambition. So very much welcome that. Then we will try to replicate that across ministries and across governments, and everybody's help for that is welcome. The role of all regions is very important, and I'm very pleased to see some regions that have been less active in the past, particularly Pacific Island states, being very, very present and moving on. We, the box at the bottom, obviously, we cannot stay stagnant. This is something that needs attention. Final slide. You may have heard me in the past talking about this vision of having a representative of all parts of civil society on the stage at the time of the finish. I don't know if the presidency will take me up on that, but virtually you should know that the vision is one that we work together. All you various convention presence in this call are important as a role to play. Very, very pleased, and I've been following your work on that. So Sylvie, this completes my presentation. I'll stop sharing my screen and give the floor back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Basile. And that was really very interesting to understand all the very detailed steps, because that is, I think each COP has its own ways of doing things, but including the mentioning of the involvement of a private sector, which is becoming stronger and stronger, is a very interesting piece of information for all of us. Thank you so much for that, Basile. I trust that Francis has not been able to join us, as you earlier mentioned. So without any further ado, I would turn to Jay Aldous, who is Deputy Secretary General of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. Jay, are you with us?
Thank you, Sylvie. What I'd like to share today are a few reflections from the perspective of the Convention on Wetlands on opportunities that can be realized through synergies. I'd like to draw your attention to the resolution that was adopted at COP14 several weeks ago on enhancing the Convention's visibility and synergies with other multilateral agreements and other international institutions. This resolution has clear language encouraging parties to continue to establish and strengthen mechanisms to enhance effective coordination to support the mainstreaming of wetland ecosystem functions and the services they provide to people and nature in national biodiversity strategies and action plans. The resolution urges MEA focal points to promote synergies through, for example, national biodiversity working groups, relevant measures in national biodiversity strategies and action plans, harmonized knowledge management, and national reporting. If our collective aim of having the global biodiversity framework be a common unifying framework that leverages relevant conventions with NBSAPs as the means by which implementation of the global biodiversity framework is operationalized, then NBSAPs have to not just connect with, but explicitly build upon and incorporate other relevant national strategies. So I think it's worth repeating what many of us have said a number of times, that the NBSAPs need to be developed with a whole of government approach with the support and approval across ministries. A couple of other important paragraphs or points within the Synergies resolution that I'd like to draw your attention to include the encouragement of national focal points to the Convention on Wetlands to increase efforts to coordinate with the Rio Conventions and other MEAs, that contracting parties and parties to the CBD to enable the adequate recognition of wetlands in the goals, targets, and indicators of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and to recognize the importance of Ramsar sites for implementing the post-2020 GBD. And lastly, request the Scientific and Technical Review Panel of the Convention on Wetlands to engage with the CBD for the development of appropriate reflection of wetlands within the indicators and monitoring framework of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So I think from the Convention on Wetlands perspective, it's important that where existing indicators and reporting frameworks exist, that these be utilized. We encourage parties during the upcoming negotiations to explicitly make them a part of the global biodiversity framework. In closing, I'd like to share with you or let you know that the Secretariat on the Convention on Wetlands remains hopeful that we will have a global biodiversity framework that provides a common framework for all, that recognizes the importance of wetlands in the goals and targets, and builds off existing instruments and tools to realize the synergies that parties to the Convention on Wetlands are seeking in the new COP14 resolution on synergies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay. And again, recalling the topic of synergies, I was wondering when you described indeed the national strategies and the reporting obligations, whether there is an opportunity to move from complexity to simplification. But I leave this question for later. Thank you so much, Jay. So from Ramsar, we move now to the CITES Convention, and I would like to invite David Morgan, the Chief of the Science Unit of the CITES Convention, to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Sylvie, and good day to you all. I was looking the other day at the proceedings of CBD's fourth COP in 1998, and the CITES Secretary General at the time spoke at that meeting to underline the need for close cooperation between CITES and CBD, and in particular stressed that a key pillar of the upcoming CBD strategic plan should be cooperation with other multilateral environment agreements. Well, that's so it was. But when the CBD COP6 adopted its strategic plan for 2002 to 2010, it was nevertheless a strategic plan for the Convention on Biological Diversity. How things have changed since then. And the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity 2011 to 2020 is a plan for everybody to promote effective implementation of action on biodiversity by all partners and stakeholders. Now, as no plan to secure biodiversity for the future can succeed without buy-in from all parts of human society, this was a very welcome development. The CITES Secretariat has always believed that biodiversity is far too important to be left to biodiversity specialists. And consequently, we're delighted to see that the current draft Global Biodiversity Framework is participative, holistic, and inclusive, as Basil Van Avre so eloquently explained. Now, we fully recognize the vital importance of the three pillars of biodiversity: maintaining genetic biodiversity, species biodiversity, and healthy functioning ecosystems. Nevertheless, species are the currency of CITES. Species are of great intrinsic value to many people around the world for aesthetic, scientific, cultural, educational, or recreational reasons. And they resonate with people who otherwise have no particular knowledge of or interest in biodiversity. And for that reason, they have a special place in people's hearts. We learnt from IPBES that around 1 million species already face extinction, many within decades, unless action is taken to reduce the intensity of drivers of biodiversity loss. And the global rate of species extinction is at least tens to hundreds of times higher than it's averaged over the past 10 million years. The average abundance of native species in most major terrestrial biomes has fallen by at least 20%, mostly since 1900, and may be accelerating. So it's great to see species feature strongly in the current draft of the framework. Now, species are of great economic value too, through provisioning for human well-being, through food, timber, fiber, fuels, pharmaceuticals, clothing, cosmetics, companion animals, horticultural specimens, amongst many other things. And trade, including trade in species, underpins human well-being, but we need to mend our relationship with nature in this regard. Now, since CITES entered into force, the human population on our planet has virtually doubled. The global economy has grown by nearly fourfold, and global trade has grown tenfold. And all of these together are driving up the demand for wild species used by humans. International trade has not been the cause of any species extinctions since CITES came into force. CITES has restricted the adverse effects of trade and demonstrated cases where international trade in wildlife specimens has benefited both humans and the species concerned. However, these win-win examples need scaling up very considerably so that the implementation of the convention is more than a damage limitation exercise and can deliver conservation and sustainable use combined. A number of goals, targets, and indicators in the current draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework address this challenge and will be contributing to their elucidation during the coming weeks. The CITES Secretariat is an active member of the Liaison Group of Biodiversity-Related Conventions, the BLG, comprising the secretariats of the 8 major global biodiversity-related conventions. And we share the BLG's objective of urging that the mandates and missions of our respective conventions are woven into the Global Biodiversity Framework vision, mission, goals, and targets, including using the data and indicators we already have in place between us for tracking progress. The global biodiversity targets also need to reflect how other sectors can impact the aspects of biodiversity that fall within our respective responsibilities. Now, as a secretariat, the CITES Secretariat has been asked by our parties to input to the negotiation process in order to strengthen the linkages between CITES and the framework and demonstrating the value of CITES to its development and identifying a role for the convention in the achievement of its objectives. CITES is a small but important part of the biodiversity jigsaw. However, to make a full picture, you need all the pieces of the jigsaw. So we wish the parties to CBD wisdom, courage, and success in their negotiations, and we can assure them that CITES and its parties will play a full role in the negotiation and implementation of the new Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you very much, and I hand back to you.
Thank you very much, David, and also recalling the bumpy road and history of a human and other species relationships. I think it's good to also put this in the perspective of what I said earlier, a life support system, but life in the wide sense of it, not only human life. Thank you so much, David, for your perspective. Let me move then from IUCN Congress to the UN Biodiversity Conference, and I would call Ms. Sonia Peña Moreno, Director, International Policy Center of IUCN, to take the floor. Over to you, Sonia.
Thank you very much, Sylvie, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I have a few slides just to guide what I'm going to present today. Just a few views from exactly the Congress that happened last year in Marseille to the road that is culminating next week or at the end of this week. So next slide, please. So IUCN members at the IUCN World Conservation Congress provided the Union with a strong mandate to engage in the process of development and implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. First, it is important to note that through the outcome document of the Congress, the so-called Marseille Manifesto, the Congress commits to address the biodiversity and climate crisis, as well as the COVID recovery, through a series of actions and commitments. In order to halt biodiversity loss, the Congress equally commits to a transformative, effective, and ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Next slide, please. So importantly, IUCN members adopted 22 resolutions that are linked to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And those 22 resolutions provide the Union with its marching orders, if you want, to engage and accompany the process from beginning to end. Resolutions can be clustered under several headings, and you have a list of broad categories there on the slide. There's one resolution that I want to mention specifically, and it stands out, is Resolution 116. It's entitled Develop and Implement a Transformational and Effective Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. This is an umbrella resolution that contains clear guidance on the scope and the elements of that the framework should contain. It ultimately calls all of us to take urgent action across societies and geographies to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, to achieve a nature-positive world for the benefit of people and the planet. Next slide. So finally, also the Congress adopted the IUCN program. We know that our economy and our society are dependent on healthy nature, healthy ecosystems, and biosphere. Through the Nature 2030 program, for the first time, the ambition is set in a decadal timeframe. So from 2021, when it was adopted, to 2030. And it's a call for the entire Union to mobilize in order to ensure that conservation of our life support system, and indeed of life in this planet, can take place and can be real. This longer-term outlook ensures precisely alignment with the existing global commitments to conserve nature, including the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the SDGs, as well as the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So through the implementation of the IUCN program, IUCN is also committed to contribute to the post-2020 framework, its development, but also its implementation. Next slide. So I wanted to finish with this image. It might be cliche, it's a dodo, brought to extinction, presumably by human activities, back in the 17th century. So it might sound trivial or cliche, but we really have no more time to lose, and we have no time left to secure an agreement in Montreal of this post-2020 framework. We cannot let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And if we want to lift the nearly 1,000 brackets or whatever number of brackets are left in the text of the GBF, we have to find ways to, bring us closer to the middle ground or to that consensus. And that doesn't mean watering down commitment or ambition, that means precisely that, finding a balanced agreement that would get us to catalyze the necessary action that is needed to tackle biodiversity loss and the crisis that we're facing. As Elizabeth said at the beginning, we need, to find that consensus, and if we don't, I don't want to sound alarmist, but extinction is indeed forever, and we don't have that luxury of time anymore. So from an IUCN side, we are going in force to Montreal, and we'll do everything that we can to help secure that successful outcome we are all looking for. So I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sonia, and thank you also for recalling the importance of the dodo. That's a balanced agreement doesn't necessarily mean a lower level of ambition. That is rather crucial to keep in mind when you go into negotiations. And thank you for reminding us that. And we don't want to be the dodo of the next decade ourselves as humans. So let's move to the civil society perspective, if you allow me. And I would invite Marco Lambertini, Director General of WWF International, to come in the discussion. Marco, are you with us?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Excellent. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you very much for the invitation. Sonia mentioned we don't have time, and honestly, I think, speaking on behalf of many other organizations, we are approaching Montreal with a mix of excitement on one hand, but also anxiety on the other. And I don't want to use a too strong comparison, but Montreal could be either the Paris or the Copenhagen for nature. Paris wasn't perfect as an outcome, but it did something absolutely critical that was missing at the time. It brought the world together around a clear direction, a clear global goal for climate, which, as we all know today, is beginning to rally concerted effort towards reaching a carbon neutral society economy by 2050 through a net zero emission goal. That's what Paris is remembered for. There were many other things that were not right, that were then improved over time, but that really what Paris did, set the direction, send the message to society, to the economy, to the markets, that was the direction on climate. We need the Montreal COP15 to do the same for nature. We've been missing that direction, measurable, clear, compelling, for too long. And that has led to a lot of actions in uncoordinated way. Everybody tried to do their best about nature and biodiversity on the back of very powerfully worded, but not so clearly measurable set of Aichi targets. And we need to change that. We need much more measurability all across the GBF, and particularly we need clarity and measurability in the mission of the GBF, in the 2030 mission. That's why we and many others are advocating for a clear global goal for nature embedded in the mission that will drive the ambition across the whole of the GBF. For nature, net zero loss is not enough. We know that we lost too much. We know that we need to restore. We know that nature can come back. And we know that a mix of conservation and restoration and sustainable management, it's the formula that will help us address not just the issue of nature loss per se, but also all the connected social and economic challenges that we're facing, from food security to water security. Of course, massive contribution to the climate change agenda as well. Human health, human well-being. Nature today is understood as a major contribution to so many dimensions of our life. And that's a new cultural, almost a cultural revolution from taking nature for granted and exploiting it as sustainably as we've done until now. So Montreal, COP15, the GBF, particularly the mission, needs to really set that direction, send that strong signal. And when we talk about, everybody talks about ambition, use the word ambition, but ambition, honestly, is a very, you can interpret, it's a very subjective concept. What we need here is an ambition in the GBF, through the goals, the targets, the indicators, the mission, actually is able to deliver the overall goal. A goal that is about halting and reversing nature loss by 2030 in order to move from a nature negative economy to a nature positive one. That's what we expect from Montreal. Let me conclude by saying that we cannot absolutely set on an unambitious GBF. I hear a lot of words about realistic, balanced. I don't hear words about courageous outcome, about a science-based outcome. This is what we need. There is no time to fuffle around. There is no time to tweak around the edges. We need an agreement that sends a strong signal that drives a big transformation in our way of living, way of producing, way of consuming, or else we will continue to see nature loss, continue until 2030, to a point where some ecosystems will reach, as you know, irreversible tipping points. And that's absolutely not an option. So we urge the leaders to, particularly the ones who have until now committed publicly to a clear ambition, for example, endorsing a halt and reverse goal, a nature positive goal by 2030, to stick to that ambition. Don't water it down. Don't let the consensus process to water it down. And we need to find ways to bring, of course, everybody on the same page, but that page needs to be the right page of the journey that we need to deliver sustainability. So that's my input, Sylvie and everyone. Thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you, Marco, and thank you for reminding us about the courage. That I think that's quite a key point in the current, let's say, multilateral context. Of course, we know about the multilateral processes are not up to the speed which is required to compare to the environmental and nature degradation. So that is probably also why it's so important to embark on many other stakeholders to bring the ambition level higher even. And I was very happy to hear that the private sector has had a very substantive contribution to the process. And in that context, I would like to invite Eva Zabe, Executive Director of Business for Nature, to take the floor. Over to you, Eva.
Thank you so much. And the pressure's on right now, because I know many of you on this call have been very positive about business engagement and ambition. And of course, I'm really grateful about that. But I also want us to be honest in that we do know that we have a long way to go. Biodiversity and broader nature loss is still a relatively new concept for most businesses, although finally more and more are starting to understand and recognize their impacts, but also their deep dependencies on natural resources, because they're starting to understand the related risks and opportunities for business, but also for the planet and people. So, one key message for me is, of course, all businesses and financial institutions must contribute to a nature positive world now. But we also know the voluntary actions, and a bit like what Marco was saying just then, the voluntary actions taking place are fragmented and clearly are not enough. And that's why we need to use the strong lever of policy and of policy ambition to urgently scale and speed up meaningful and impactful business action. So with those mixed feelings, like Marco was saying, going into COP15, mix of excitement, mix of anxiety, I think the two messages I'd like to share today is, one, we need to ride the wave of exponential momentum in the business community. And then second is, we need to keep the ambition high through business leadership. And so just to expand a little, On the first one, we need to ride this wave of exponential momentum in the business community that others have alluded to. We've never seen this level of engagement from business and finance before. And let's be honest also, COP15 has been a hook for that engagement, as well as, of course, the IPBES and other key important science-based references that we can hook onto. But the actual engagement with COP15 is a hook, and within the Global Biodiversity Framework, Target 15 is a concrete entry point for business and finance to understand then their broader role in helping to implement the framework itself. So overall, we know that over 700 individuals from business and finance have registered to attend COP15. Of course, by far not will actually be able to be there, but they will be following virtually. And that sends already a really strong signal to policymakers that nature and biodiversity loss are becoming a more material issue for them. We had a webinar just last week where for businesses who were planning on attending, and 90% said that this would be their first ever CBD COP. So that is also a bit of an indication. It also means that we need a bit more hand-holding to bring newcomers into this family. So also I would just say, as both Elizabeth and Basile were talking about the need to have those businesses and financial institutions there to give that courage and that comfort to the negotiators that they actually do want an ambitious framework, a transformative framework. They want the clear targets and goals that they all can and must then contribute towards. But let's be honest also, once again, I keep on saying let's be honest, I must correct that, but I really do think we have to be honest here. But there's a risk that after COP15, especially if the outcome falls short, nature will fall back down the business, finance, and political agenda. And we cannot let that happen. So regardless of the outcome, we also need a joint, strong plan of action for business. And that's where we need the radical collaboration that we already see happening across organizations, and it will be essential. So talking a bit more now about the need for keeping the ambition high and that business leadership. As Business for Nature, we're a global coalition of 78 partner organizations, and we've been working really closely also on the technical negotiations. So we have a pretty long technical document with all of our recommendations that's been built on through consultation with many businesses and organizations. They go into the text recommendations, justifications, and I feel like that's been something that maybe has changed in the sense of at least negotiators seem to be very, grateful for that constructive way forward. And we're trying to be as constructive and helpful as possible. I should share our 3 top priorities going into COP15. Number 1 is on Target 15, which is the business target. What we need in Target 15 is we need to make it mandatory for all businesses and financial institutions to assess and disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature. We have more than 330 companies from around the world that support this message, and having mandatory in the target will play a catalyst role because it will help the information flow through our whole accountability system so that regulators, capital markets, investors, consumers are getting the information they need to be able to manage our precious shared natural resources properly. We see with the frameworks coming up, the science-based targets for nature methodologies, the task force on nature-related financial disclosures. There are many existing frameworks that companies can already use. And I should be clear that even though we are pushing for mandatory assessment and disclosure, by all means, that is not an end in itself. That is the beginning, but you cannot take meaningful action without fully understanding which impacts and dependencies you should be acting upon. And then the second important part in target 15 is we're very supportive of a numerical target to reduce by at least 50% the negative impacts and then increase positive impacts on biodiversity. All of these within the 2030 timeline that is set out in the Global Biodiversity Framework. Our second priority is on target 18. That's the one that's about environmentally harmful subsidies, and that needs to be really strong. So we're pushing for an ambitious target 18, building on some new research that came out this year, maybe you'll have seen, stating that $1.8 trillion each year, that's 2% of GDP, unintentionally flows to subsidies that are environmentally harmful. We have a massive opportunity as part of this whole resource mobilization question of redirecting those subsidies towards nature positive outcomes. And if we don't address that elephant in the room, then we're not going to be able to make progress. And leading businesses recognize that and need to understand how they benefit and how they can help governments transition towards transitioning those, redirecting those subsidies while making sure that the socioeconomic benefits, all of those people's livelihoods, stay central so that we're definitely not having an unintentionally negative impact on people. And the third priority for us within the Global Biodiversity Framework relates to what Marco was saying, that mission up front. And it was interesting at the beginning, some negotiators say, why are you focusing so much on the mission? We must focus on the targets. We say, yes, but like we have in the Paris Agreement, we need to have a clear mission, the clear rallying call that everyone can contribute to. And that has to be halt and reverse nature loss, biodiversity loss by 2030 to be nature positive by 2030. And that's something that we're very supportive of because it sets the direction and the urgency to act that companies and financial institutions can then contribute to. So leading businesses are calling for an ambitious framework that will transform the systems that we all operate within. We're talking about major transformational shifts of our economic system, our financial system, and a Paris-like agreement is what is needed now to give the political certainty, because that's what the companies need right now, to really invest, innovate, and shift their business models. So there is no business on a dead planet, and companies are starting to realize that. And we're here to help. Let's not waste this massive opportunity that is COP15, and let's reset our relationship with nature. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Eva, for this very enlightening contribution and basically your plea to let's now go together between the policymakers and the private sector, but your call on the major investment shifts which are needed for this transformation is very well heard. I think I've heard that $1 invested in nature action is potentially bringing back $4 in return on investment from data from the World Bank. I think that brings us to the end of a panel presentations, and thank you to all of you for those various viewpoints all converging in the same direction. I see that quite a lot of questions in the Q&A box. I see that Basil has been answering quite a few of them already. Maybe Basil, you want to take the floor and summarize maybe some of the topics which were addressed to you?
Thank you, and appreciate the comments and the question that were put to the chat. A couple of questions about where does the right of indigenous people and local communities stand in the GBF, and basically what I would point is that there is, in fact, this is an issue that we call cross-cutting, as it is in fact concerning every goal and target in the framework. And as such, the suggestion is to cover that mainly through a mention in an introductory section that would cover cross-cutting issues. We call that the fundamental premises. and then to possibly repeat it in a couple targets, particularly the one on land and sea use change. There is a significant support I see for the mention of human right based approach to protection and conservation. So that will be there. And Jörg Stodenman was pointing to the work CIPRI is doing on right-based approach, and I was going to write in there that we should see conservation and protection as both a challenge in those countries where there is a challenge around land tenures, etc., but also as an opportunity for reconciliation. There is a number of experience that shows that a truly integrative and joint management of a protected and conserved space can be part of a reconciliation process with indigenous people. Then there is another stream around trade and the importance of trade and how trade is affecting biodiversity and the GBF. There is the well-known impact, negative impact of some trade activities, but at the same time, science is showing us that trade is an essential tool to minimize the land and sea impact of productive activities. If you're trying to minimize the land and sea use, then you would be concentrating some of the production activities where it's most productive, and then there is an element of trade to get it from there to where the population are. So the key point is, and then I'm going back to target 15 and what Eva has been saying, is to ensure that the economic model that sustain trade are fully reflecting the cost of nature and is sustainable. And in that sense, target 15, and in particular, the requirement for a large company to ensure the supply chain is sustainable will be an essential tool. So thank you. Very useful debate. I wish I would have 4 hands and 2 brains to follow what's going on the chat and at the same time in the presentation. Back to you, Sylvie.
Thank you so much, Basil. And indeed, it's quite a challenge to keep an eye also on the chat from my end. But thank you for the answers. Very extremely useful. I see that we have a colleague from the UNEP Climate Finance Unit, UNEP Climate Finance Unit, Ivo Mulder, online. Listening to the discussions, Ivo, would you have some perspective from your end and the linkages you have from your work stream? I think that would be quite interesting to establish a little bit some parallels. Over to you, Ivo.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvie. So basically building on what Marco and Eva was saying, just now that COP27 is over and COP15 is around the corner, we'll be launching the State of Finance for Nature report tomorrow, which will be calling for more than doubling of investments into nature-based solutions, basically saying time is up, while at the same time phasing out nature negative, both public and private finance flow. So it's very much in line with what Marco and Eva was saying. COP15 is a major momentum. The report that we're launching tomorrow is basically saying if we want to stay within a 1.5 degree warming target, if we want to turn around biodiversity loss and restore the land that has been lost as well as the seascapes, then the time for delay and the time for inaction simply is over. I think a good, ambitious, measurable global biodiversity framework can really provide that kind of momentum. And I hope that tomorrow's report will give negotiators another impetus to actually make that happen. Thanks, Sylvie.
Thank you for this additional piece to the puzzle, which is pulling nicely together at this moment. Maybe as we have the privilege to have Elizabeth with us. Elizabeth, would you have some maybe feedback to provide us with on the discussion which took place and possibly on a few questions we already had in the chat?
Questions on the chat, of course, they are referring directly to the draft post-2020 framework, which I will be scared to put my word in front of the co-chair present, because their answer is the correct one than mine. But I think the question related to IPLCs, Indigenous Peoples, local community, they have been, I will say, listened very carefully, engaged throughout the entire process. I mean, I think if it is one stakeholder group which the co-chairs went beyond the expectation, has been the engagement of IPLCs. There's been a series of webinars, even as the draft development process has been going on at each and every stage. Thereafter, they've specifically been briefing the IPLCs to be able to receive again further their comments into it. Not surprising that the conclusion basically ended from where Basil said IPLC's inclusion and relevance should be in each and every target. But then we cannot do that. That's why then there is that proposal of including as part of the cross-cutting chapeau chapter of the framework, the importance and the role of the IPLCs, and then in the framework to be only a few priority for them selected targets. But the engagement with them has been enormous. Compliments to the co-chairs.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. David, you want to take the floor?
I see co-chair also wants to take the floor.
Basil, you want to take the floor?
Yes, if I may speak, I want to make a point about the importance of the link from one COP to the other. I think the outcome of the climate COP will be having a very large and positive influence on our COP. I think when I'm talking with colleagues from developing countries, particularly those that have negotiated for the loss and damage fund, there is a sense of trust in the community of delegates, but trust also in multilateral processes that situate us in a good point. I think they came out of the Sharm el-Sheikh negotiation with the sentiment of having been heard and having been able to influence the process, and that has been essential. And my sense also is that we are well situated and definitively will try to be capitalizing on, I call that the climate, the non-tangible elements of the negotiation. So yes, there was some word put on paper, but beyond those words on the paper is the attitude and the outlook of delegates when they come to Montreal. There will be, I think, coming up with their attitude open to compromise and trust in the system, which will be very important. Thank you. Back to you, Sylvie.
Thank you, Basil. We will have some closing remarks from Niklaus Wagner, who is Senior Policy Advisor, International Affairs Division of the Federal Office for the Environment of Switzerland. But before I leave him the space for the closing remarks, I would like to ask other panelists if they have further contribution to the discussion. And maybe also we mentioned getting human close to the nature of rehabilitation of a relationship we've got with nature. How do we make sure that we have civil society, youth, and other movements fully engaged in such processes? I think, David, you mentioned indeed from your perspective that species protection in particular were very close to, let's say, the humans' sensibility. Maybe you have some views about your experience engaging with civil society movements.
Yeah, thank you, Sylvie. Well, I think we need to turn warm thoughts and words into action. That's the key here. We all know that we have a special attraction, for instance, to species, but that doesn't translate into action. And I think that's the nexus that we need to work at. And I think from the point of view of mobilizing civil society, we need to, as part of our when hopefully an ambitious global biodiversity framework is agreed, we need a process of outreach to all sectors to get everybody on board and behind what's been decided, to turn the as I say, the warm words into action. So I think that's maybe the negotiators now are from the parties to CBD, but afterwards we need to bring everybody together and get behind the wheel and deliver what's been put down on paper. Thanks.
Thank you, David. I see the ladies popping up on the screen, so maybe you want to take the floor, Eva, and then Sonia in turn.
Well, thanks. Yes, I just wanted to react as you were asking for some, some reflections. We know we don't have all the perfect methodologies, we don't have all the perfect solutions, but we actually do know a lot, and we need to build on the indigenous communities, the conservation organizations, the science that we know. We do already know a lot, and we should trust that, because we do know what needs to happen. And so the Global Biodiversity Framework is only negotiated every 10 years. So even though we're going into December COP15 without a perfect set of super squeaky clean plan, we're in crisis management mode. We don't have time to hatch the perfect plan. That's what happens when you're in crisis mode. And I hope that that also gives the confidence that good enough to keep the action moving is what we need now. Thank you.
Thank you. Sonia?
Yeah, just, a reflection on this issue of the high-level principles or cross-cutting issues that should, permeate all of the targets and be presumably in all of them. Considerations like the, rights-based approaches, the indigenous peoples and local communities recognition, gender, women and youth, and many others, like, the synergies across different frameworks and conventions when we get into implementation of the GBF. And everything in this high level principles have been placed for the moment in that section B bis that is being discussed as well. But I think that it's important not to think that because we place that in the high level principles, it automatically applies to all the targets. And some targets in particular will have to deal with this discussion of whether or not in the language of the target itself and then in the indicators include some of those high level principles. And in particular on the indigenous peoples and local communities, I think it's important to see where across the framework, apart from that section, BBIS or whatever it ends up being called, where should we really place consideration, recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples. So just to leave that reflection there. And I agree completely with Eva on the issue of let's not make the perfect be the enemy of the good, as I said before. So we have to compromise somewhere, without that meaning leaving ambition behind.
Thank you, Sonia. Okay, we keep the mission well in our heads. So I don't see any other panelists wishing to take the floor last time. So I would discreetly retreat myself and disappear, and I pass on the floor to Niklaus Wagner. Over to you, Niklaus.
Thank you so much, Sylvie, and dear Excellencies, distinguished colleague. It is really my privilege to conclude this session after all these remarks, highly relevant inputs, but also powerful comments from the really high-level panel today, but also the rich discussion. I think this panel today is another great example of the important role that Geneva-based organizations and also Geneva-based conventions play for the post-2020 GBF. And it is also testimony of Geneva as a global hub for global environmental policy. even more so as besides Ramsar COP14 and other conferences, also the third negotiation round for the GBF was hosted by Switzerland in Geneva. And in this sense, it was really great to also have Elizabeth and Basil in Geneva. So we can consider also them as Geneva-based this year, at least in March. The comments today made it clear that we need to adopt an ambitious post-2020 GBF with a strengthened implementation mechanism. We need to be more effective and more efficient in implementing the measurable goals and targets, because in the end, we have to have a maximum impact on the ground. Now, we have heard today many relevant points that were suggested to be considered to make the new framework a success. We have also heard many relevant actors and organizations that will play a critical role in supporting and contributing to the implementation of the framework, including civil society, international organizations, but also the private sector. Now, allow me to highlight one element that Switzerland considers of particular importance for a successful implementation, which is the critical role of biodiversity-related conventions, including the Ramsar and CITES convention that were present in the panel today. Basil and Jay Aldous, but also David Morgan, have already referred to the importance of synergies. So I'm happy to take this as a focus of my last remarks. As a party to the biodiversity-related conventions, Switzerland is convinced that even though the GBF is negotiated under the regime of the CBD, all relevant conventions have to make their contribution to the implementation of the goals and targets, of course, within their respective mandates. However, if we want this requires that the conventions are included in the development, but also in the implementation of the GBF. And that's why we have invited to 2 workshops on this topic, Burn 1 and Burn 2, and many of you participated. The main aim of the Burn process so far was to strengthen the involvement of parties, but also of secretariats of the relevant conventions in this negotiation process. Now, once the framework will be adopted, we see a great need to continue this process, which has been known as the Burn process. In our view, some of the important questions that should be addressed and should be discussed among parties of the different conventions are the following 3. First, how can these different conventions concretely contribute to the achievement of the specific goals and targets of the GBF? Second, how can a future GBF reporting and review mechanism be really most effectively informed by not only by the CBD parties, but also by input from all the biodiversity-related conventions? Basil has already referred to the importance of the data reporting tool DART, that in our view, of course, will be a crucial tool to inform the reporting and review mechanism. Now the third question is how can these conventions in the end contribute to a potential global stocktake for the GBF? All these questions, we are convinced that the governing bodies of these different conventions can benefit a lot from the conclusions of these questions. So, as you know, parties did not wait until CBD COP15 to discuss about the future of the Bern process. But parties discussed it already, for example, at the governing body meetings of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, but also at the Ramsar COP14 and CITES COP19. And they made important decisions at these meetings on the Bern process. Governing Body 9 of the International Treaty and Ramsar COP14 invited UNEP to continue facilitating the Bern process and requested their secretariats and encouraged parties to continue engaging in the Bern process. CITES COP19 decided to take into account the outcomes of the Bern process when strengthening synergies between CITES and the GBF. In our view, parties of these conventions have sent very strong signals to the CBD COP15 to adopt a global framework that focuses on effective implementation, including through the contributions of the biodiversity-related conventions, but also of other instruments. So in this sense, we look forward to working with all relevant actors and organizations in Montreal with the view of adopting an ambitious and comprehensive GBF. To conclude, I would like to thank the distinguished high-level panelists for their time and relevant inputs, but everyone who contributed to make this event today a success in such busy times. Thank you also to Sylvie for the great moderation, and of course also the Geneva Environment Network for organizing, inviting, and do all the work in the back office. With this, I thank all of you, and I hope to see many of you in Montreal, and I wish to all of you safe travels for those who are not yet in Montreal. So thank you once again, and I conclude this event today. Thank you.